I think it's time to make some more bases. Today we're going to make some high quality bases for your heroes and characters. To spice things up a little bit, I won't use an airbrush on any of the bases in today's video. Also, there's a Black Friday announcement at the end of this video, so stick around for some juicy deals. You know who also has some juicy deals for you? The sponsor of today's video, Squarespace. It's the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and run your business. All right, let's hit it. So you have a slotted base and a miniature without a slot. Let's take advantage of that. With an X-Acto knife and some clippers, I start to remove chunks of the base to create a little window. Then below this base, I begin to adhere varied diameter cylinders made of styrene like there are pipes running below the surface of this base. With that complete, I busted out my trusty circle cutter and some thin styrene and cut a disc approximately the size of my base. This tool can be a little tricky to use, and I found if I stab it in real good, try not to dig too deep with the blade itself, and also spin the material and not the tool, I tend to get a better result. Now with my little styrene disc, I start to cut out shapes with some parallel and perpendicular lines. This is going to be a SciFi base, so having some angular panels like this works out great. I made sure to keep a piece of styrene out to act as a window for my below ground plumbing to be shown off. I then glued down all the styrene with plastic glue and let it fully cure before moving on to the next step. I didn't do the greatest job of cutting a disc that was the right diameter, so I had to trim it down with my clippers and a little sanding. With that done, I began to deepen the panel lines with a triangle file. You could totally just scribe lines with an X-Acto knife and deepen those lines with a file and skip the step where you cut the individual pieces of styrene entirely, but I figured because I was already cutting a hole for the pipes, I'd just cut all the lines completely. I went back and forth with the file and also some sandpaper to deal with the burr of plastic that appears when filing the grooves. To further the sci-fi tube aesthetic, which is a genre I'm super into obviously, I grabbed some even larger hollow rods of styrene and cut the ends at a 45-degree angle and glued them onto my base. Lastly, for one final detail, I glued on two very tiny connector-looking bits for what I wanted to be a cable. I made these connectors with some styrene cylinders that I hollowed out with my X-Acto knife because I didn't have any hollow rods this small. Then with some thin aluminum wire, I glued and bent a cable fairly flush to the surface. Aluminum is becoming one of my favorite materials to work with because of how soft and malleable it is. With that last detail done, it's time to move on to the painting. I primed this base black and then began to paint the tubes and cables with yellow and red. I figured I'd start there because this might get a little messy. While I had the yellow out, I also gave my little cable some fun hazard striping. With that done, I began to paint the panels with a dark silver, and I could also cover up the yellow and red mistakes that I made prior. I avoided the grooves so they stayed nice and dark, but if you get some silver in there, just paint some black back into those spots. With that done, I began to sponge on a much brighter silver to imitate some wear and tear on the ground. Lastly, I mixed together some matte varnish and some dry pigments to make a mud slurry that I also sponged on for some dirt and grime. The last and most important step of this process is to paint the base rim nice and black. I've been seeing a lot of dirty base rims out there in the wild, so we need to spread the gospel of a clean base rim better. I don't really care what color you paint it as long as it's painted and also it's black. That should finish up what I'm dubbing Tube City. To start off our little football pitch, we'll apply some dirt with some super glue and seal it all in with some super glue thin. The rest of the work will be done post-static grass application, so onto the painting. After some priming that was honestly not needed, I painted the dirt a brown tone, followed up with a lighter brown dry brushing. I like scale 75 for dirt because it's nice and matte, and I'm trying to imitate a drier field. With that done, I painted on some PVA glue in a mostly covered, partially spotty way and then applied some static grass. Since I don't have a fancy static grass applicator, the way I try to get grass to stand up is by blowing it from all sides and rotating the base constantly. It doesn't work amazingly, but it's good enough and I don't have to spend fat stacks on a single purpose tool. At some point, I should probably just pick one up. With PVA glue dry, I took a beard trimmer, which I have no use for because I can't grow a beard, and trimmed my grass so it was nice and flat. I'm going for a turf-like length and uniformity. With my turf looking awfully turfy, I taped off a line and sponged on some white paint. The sponge is nice here because it creates a spottier line instead of a perfect fresh one. To add some variety to the grass, I add in some longer pieces, maybe some flowers or little tiny clumps of different colors, kind of like this field hasn't been taken care of in a long time. Lastly, I added a little spray of blood, again with a sponge, because Blood Bowl and Guild Ball, rest in peace, are pretty violent sports. I finished it off with a nice, crispy base rim. This is the most important and crucial step in the process, and if you skip this, you're dead to me. You know who'd never skip painting a base rim? The sponsor of this video, Squarespace. I don't have a personal gallery for my miniature painting art, so when Squarespace reached out to me to sponsor a video, I took this as an opportunity to use their platform to build a dedicated gallery for myself. A gallery like this is useful for a number of reasons. For those who don't know what miniature painting is, I'm looking at you, Aunt Amy. This shows them in a succinct, beautiful way. Importing images and dealing with alignment is made easy, and all the while creating a website that just looks awesome. It's important that your gallery show your work while also being functional and beautiful itself. If I need to see a bigger resolution of this miniature so I can see the creamy blends, it's as simple as double clicking. If you want to save some fat stacks on making a miniature art gallery for yourself, head to squarespace.com/Miniac to save 10% off of your first purchase of a website or domain using the code Miniac at checkout. All right, back to the base making. To start out, we'll glue down a cool looking stick onto our base with milliput and some super glue. I figure a model like this would be able to stand nicely on a log this size. To create some more branches, I drilled a few holes in the stick and added some fluoro wire to act as an armature. After that, I applied some thin pieces of milliput over the wire and began to carve in some bark texture. This does not need to look perfect, and it'll sort of be obscured later. To smooth out some of the flakiness of milliput, I paint the textured milliput with an old brush and some water. Lastly, I add some more texture with some dirt, but I didn't put it on the other half of the base. I want to make that portion of the base a pond, and I didn't want to raise it up any more than it already was by adding a layer of dirt. Time to get this guy primed up. Again, I'll be using black. Let's slap on some base coats. I did a quick and dirty wet blend to start out with using paint right out of the pot. I painted the area of the pond that I wanted to be deepest a nice dark color, and the portion closer to the shore I painted a lighter grass green color. While that paint was still wet, I also painted the ground a dark brown color like it might be wet mud, and also the tree a sickly green color. During this entire process, my paint stayed workable because I wasn't thinning it so much, so I was able to blend all those tones nicely together. I decided to make the deep end a little deeper with some glazing of black right near the edge. Because the tree seemed a little too light, I hit it with a brown wash to darken it down. I don't really have my whole painting process figured out. I'm just kind of winging it, just like you might be. With that nice and dry, I dry brushed the dirt and the tree itself with some pastel yellow color very lightly. This color could show up more than I wanted to if we're not being careful. Like the football pitch base, a lot of the work here is going to be done with flora and fauna. To start out, I applied some small micro tufts. By the way, if you're curious what products that I'm using, I've linked a few web stores in the description below that I get stuff from and am a fan of. Next, I added some long grass that will be poking out of the water. I glued this down in most of my static grass products with super glue. I added a good variety of different plants to mimic what you might find in real life, like flowers, different types of tufts, and so on. Onto the branches, I add some dyed sponge material to act like little tree brushes, which will help obscure our shoddy sculpting work. To have some hanging moss, I took some cotton and dipped it in a mixture of green ink, scenic glue, which I'll have a recipe for linked in the description, and some brown wash to desaturate the green. I could then drape the small little pieces of this cotton on the branches of my log to give it a really good swamp vibe. Lastly, I worked on the water. I used a combination of Liquitex liquid sand, which dries clear and has a nice bubbly texture to it, and also gloss gel medium, which I used closer to the shore of this little pond. The green gradient underneath will make this water appear as though it is green because the products we're using are transparent. I also added in some small glass orbs that you might find people using in nail art that make the pond look even more bubbly. Lastly, I paint the base rim, and you can wait until the water products dry, or you can just be impatient like me and paint it right away. Just be careful you don't get any liquid sand on the base rim. You'll tarnish its beauty with texture. That should finish off the swamp base. Alright, on to the last and my most favorite base of these four. I wanted to make a cobblestone texture like this dragon had taken up residence in a dwarf hall or something. I covered the base in a thin, even veneer of milliput and began sculpting little cobblestone shapes. Alternatively, you could just punch little circles with a piece of hollow brass or styrene. You could even pinch the styrene a little bit to get a more oblong shape if you wanted to. With all my cobblestones outlined, I started to push the styrene that was supposed to be below the stones toward them. Essentially, I need to remove the material that's in between my rocks so they look like they're actually protruding a little bit. I used both silicone shapers and some metal sculpting tools to accomplish this. There are many ways to make cobblestones, and this isn't the most helpful for you, such as using Green Stuff World rollers. You could also very easily mold and cast this in resin, so you only have to do it once per base size in your army. When that looked vaguely cobblestone-like, I left it to dry so that I could come back and flatten some of these stones with some sandpaper. I like milliput so much because it can be nicely shaped after it's fully cured. With that done, I started to add a variety of rocks, both big and small. I also added some dirt as well, trying to scatter it tastefully around the base, such as not to obscure the cobblestones entirely, but enough to give it a good randomness. I sealed this all in with some super glue thin, and I sponged up some of the excess with some paper towel so I didn't lose definition in my rocks. If you do this soon after applying the glue, the paper towel shouldn't stick. Next up, I needed to add the remnants of the people who had come to challenge the dragon and steal his loot. With an old Empire head bit, I removed the head part with an X-Acto knife and also my Dremel to grind and hollow it out a bit. I glued this part down onto the base on a thin piece of styrene rod like the helmet was resting on an arrow shaft. The last bit of fabrication was to cut more of that styrene rod into small coins. Your kitchen knife skills are going to come in handy here. I then sprinkled these onto the base and adhered them with more superglue thin, sponging up the excess just like we did previously. Now onto the painting. I started this with a gradient from front to back of blues, trying to give off a damp, cold cave vibe. I then washed it with a black to tone down the saturation, but also to show off the cool cobblestone texture. I made sure to sponge up any of the wash that was pooling on the flat of the rock. Once that was dry, I then dry brushed the whole thing with a light gray to show off some of the texture of the different rocks and the dirt. Next, I moved on to painting some various details. I started painting the helmet red, focusing my highlights toward the top of the helmet. Then with some black and silver paint, I added in some battle damage because obviously this guy did not live to tell his dragon slaying tale. I did the same process with the skull but used browns and creams. I kept this skull darker like it's been in the cave for a long time. To add some nice contrasting colors and finishes, I applied some dark reddish brown dry pigments to the various rocks and dirt piles on my base. This breaks up the blue really nicely. I then painted the gold coins with a single layer of gold because that's all they really need. As some extra credit, I added a scratchy edge highlight to the edges of the various cobblestones to really make them stand out. You could very easily ignore this step if you wanted to. Next up is my favorite step. I took some nail art gems and glued them onto the treasure heap. I put one large gem in there like it was the prized possession of the hall, and then a bunch of smaller ones. I used regular PVA glue for the big gem, and for the smaller ones, I placed them by picking them up with a damp brush and then putting them on the base, and then applied a small amount of sealing glue around each gem. Lastly, and most importantly, I painted the base frame black, and that finishes up our 4 bases for this video. Creating bases is refreshingly easy and low stress. It's a great way to decompress after a heavy, long paint job. It's also a great way to express some creativity and explore. Treat these videos not so much as a step-by-step, but a list of options. Any part of these bases can be some kind of inspiration. Maybe you want to do the Tube City base but leave off the little cable. Or maybe you want to do the swamp base without a tree. Anything goes here. Pick and choose to your heart's content. If you enjoyed this video, I've done a few other videos in this format. Any base you see here has a video showing off exactly how to make that base, so check it out if you'd like to. Alright, Black Friday announcement time. Everything in my web store is 20% off. This is actually the first time that either my model, the Duchess, or the digital course for the Duchess has been on sale, so grab it while it's steamy and hot. If the course is still a little too steeply priced and you want some guidance on how to paint the Duchess, I now have a digital PDF available for you to look at while painting that summarizes the techniques and the paints used on the model in a nice succinct way. I also have a new shirt out, which is also on sale. A lot of people have been requesting a non-black t-shirt, which I don't fully understand because black is the greatest color for a t-shirt, but here it is. If you've ever felt like your backlog of unpainted miniatures is an angry golem and you want to go Conan on it, this shirt is perfect for you and will definitely help you paint the backlog faster or your money back. Obviously, I'm joking. Lastly, if you're outside of the United States, we'll have reduced shipping costs for you as well. This sale is going on for the entirety of Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday, ending on Monday at 12 a.m. CST. That's it for this video, guys. Subscribe or die! But most importantly, don't forget to paint my Miniac!